From Doc to Doctor by Roger Yates in Critical Voices in Criminology, edited by Chris Powell, 2009, Lexington Books. Note, for this special 2024 audio version, I've included selected endnotes within the main text. In attempting to comply with the intentions behind this collection, to offer original writings of personal and professional interest where authors can explore issues more generally, subjected to self-censorship in other formal presentations, I must interweave the relevant interests and also investigate my past activities, especially those that lead to a career in the social sciences. To this end, I have initiated a novel epistemological and methodological move. Namely, I have interviewed my former self. In the established traditions of qualitative research, I found that the vexed issues of access and rapport were catered for with relative ease in this instance, anticipating, of course, that on the issues of validity and reliability, I may well be on much less stable ground. Both professionally and as a social movement participant in the area of animal protection, and especially in animal rights theory and advocacy, my chief interest is in green criminology and zemiology. From the late 1980s onwards, especially after reading the likes of C. Wright Mills, Jürgen Habermas, and Stuart Hall, and seeing them described as bridge figures, Stephen Seidman, who simultaneously engaged in academia and in debates in the public sphere, my intention has been to try to offer some sociological knowledge and theoretical clarity to the social movement I cared about. More of that later. First, to green criminology and zemiology. Both are marginalized issues in academia, but the former has fared rather better than the latter in recent times. Zemiology, or harmology, was launched in 1999 at a conference in Devon, England, and featured prominent British criminologists and sociologists such as Phil Scraton, Paddy Hilliard, Joe Sim, Tony Ward, and Steve Toms. Regretfully, the zemiological project has since largely floundered. As my own small contribution to the zemiological project, I characterized my doctoral thesis, The Social Construction of Human Beings and Other Animals in Human-Non-Human Relations, as a work of non-speciesist zemiology. Although zemiology has stalled somewhat, green criminology, despite Mark Halsey's attempt to nip it in the bud, Piers Byrne, is now an established, if still emerging discipline aligned with critical criminologies, and indeed zemiology's aspirations of looking beyond street crimes where conventional criminology tends to languish. Green criminology has brought to us the concept of green-collar criminals, Michael O'Hear, to add to Edwin Sutherland's white-collar variety. Michael Lynch, who claims to have produced the first discussion of green criminology in 1990, argues that its purview incorporates the interests of studies in eco-critical criminology, for example, Harold Barnett, Nancy Wilson, environmental justice C. Dorsetta Taylor, and non-speciesism in criminology, the latter taking its intellectual lead from Piers Byrne and C. Gertrude Cazot. Eco-critical criminology may encompass a philosophical position based on the notion of the land ethic, which defines harms, rights, and ethics in relation to environmental issues. This ethic is utilized to investigate how human behavior impacts on the biotic community. Therefore, those behaviors judged to preserve the environment are characterized as positive, while those behaviors that damage or act to disrupt environmental equilibrium are regarded as negative. Some of the latest work in this field have been ethnographic investigations of environmentalism and social movement mobilization in the Republic of Ireland. Mary Kelly, Hilary Tovey. The environmental justice movement places emphasis on environmental racism, for example, in studies of population proximity to hazardous waste facilities, toxic dumps, and landfills. This movement is seen as distinct from the overwhelmingly white and middle-class environmental movement that emerged in the 1960s and grew in the 1970s as part of the shift towards so-called new social movements, and forms part of the aftermath of the New Left students' mobilizations. See Todd Gitlin, Joe Freeman, and Victoria Johnson. The non-speciesist approach in green and critical criminology may situate non-human harm at the center of study, whereas many orthodox criminological investigations involving non-human animal harm unreflexively regards animals as human property and concentrates on legal concepts such as criminal damage and the theft of private property. For example, in the case of horse maiming, or the media's preferred phrase, horse ripping, Roger Yates, Chris Powell, and Piers Bairn. A similar critique of the property status of non-human animals is at the center of the reinvigorated abolitionist animal rights perspective, the foremost exponent of which is lawyer and philosopher Gary Francione. Endnote 1. Francione provides a contrast to Tom Reagan's complex subject of a life criteria for the basis of non-human animal rights, and suggests that all sentient animals need and deserve one right, the right not to be another's property. Of these major concerns in green criminology, my principal interest is the non-speciesist approach to analysis. However, along with the spirit of animal rightist, humanitarian, and social reformer, Henry Salt and many contemporary ecofeminist writers, for example, Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva and Carol Adams, I accept that justice and exploitation issues are ontologically intertwined and see David Niebert. While my route into the initial study of criminology was unconventional, it followed that of a limited number of scholars in the sense of my being a convicted criminal was soon to be followed by being a criminologist, or at least a sociologist in which the sociology of crime featured prominently in my studies. Stating the obvious, the Academy is an excessively middle-class institution, so it is rather ironic, perhaps, that my introduction to academia was facilitated by being sent along with lots of other working-class men into the British criminal justice and prison systems. Without the opportunities afforded by the Education Department of a semi-open prison in Lancashire, Englandy would simply not be teaching and working in the higher education sector at all. However, it certainly was not plain sailing when I attempted to move from a prison education unit to a proper university. My application to the sociology department at the University of Wales, Bangor, apparently sparked a minor security alert, prompting what was described to me later as a special meeting to discuss whether it was felt safe that I be admitted to the North Wales campus, and in particular, whether there was a threat to any of the university's animal laboratories. Yes, I was one of those animal rights nutters, John Curtin, and even though it was still more than a decade away from the planes crashing into the Twin Towers in New York, animal people were already liable to be labeled as domestic terrorists, a label presumably taken seriously by some. Certainly, by the 1980s, the Hunt Saboteurs Association were being characterized by specialist police officers as terrorists not connected to the IRA. And so, my journey from convict to criminology, or from doc to doctor as I expressed it recently in a blog entry, begins in the 1980s. In this decade, I held a number of exclusively unpaid positions within the then revitalized British animal protection community, the mass mobilization that is, and with monotonous regularity, mistakenly identified as the modern animal rights movement. Endnote 2, Francione describes the contemporary social movement that goes under the name animal rights as a new welfarist mobilization. It may not be the most diplomatic thing to thus characterize advocates who think of themselves as radicals and hardcore, but that does not mean it is not an accurate characterization. It certainly seems to capture the progressive welfarist position of a movement inspired in the main by the writings of utilitarian animal welfarist Peter Singer. To add complexity, however, the modern animal protection movement also includes other non-rightists, describing themselves as influenced by anarchic or ecofeminist principles, who are wary or straightforwardly opposed to the notion of bourgeois or male-minded individual rights. Lawyer Lee Hall describes the sort of activists I used to represent as a press officer as animal welfare militants. Like most social movement advocates, or protesters is a general term, perhaps even one of Howard Becker's moral entrepreneurs, I had internalized the neutralizing message that if one discovers an important issue in society, then one writes to one's member of parliament. If extra especially moved, then a petition requires signing, or for the totally committed, the actual organizing of a petition is warranted. Like so many others, I swallowed all this unquestioningly, so much so that I found myself in the 1980s at the constituency office of my local MP, conservative Marcus Fox, who smiled politely yet dismissively. It was clear that he felt that a concern for non-human animals beyond the usual lip service granted to traditional forms of animal welfarism was indication of a gross distortion of priorities and values. However, I persisted in engaging in conventional and authorized modes of protest, joining groups, organizing jumble sales, going on sponsored walks, and several other diverting activities. Exactly when the penny drops is, of course, different for different people. Eventually, however, most discover that they are rather wasting their time when they are, officially, protesting. I guess it took quite a time for my coin to drop. My poor but decent upbringing. My father was a coal miner, but also a part-time special constable, and my mother owned a general store. The always open shop in a very small Yorkshire village certainly did not help. No scruffy inner-city estate to radicalize me. Being white in England, no racist taunts. No police would kick down our door. After all, the local inspector in the special force had his own key. And note 3. During the 1980s, I was arrested on various demonstrations on a few occasions, and it wasn't until her son's contact with the police in this way that prompted my mother to remember that my father had a special pair of brown leather gloves which he used when beating suspects at his police station, presumably a little time before the signing of the voluntary confession. My mother had previously and wholly unproblematically filed this information away, content that only the wrong sort and those who deserved it had been at the receiving end of my father's justice punches. A couple of jobs I held once I'd liberated myself from petitions and jumble sales involved reporting to media contacts on some of the more militant styles of campaigning on behalf of non-human animals. This was typically passing on the details of the physical liberation of non-human animals from laboratories, farms, and other places of enslavement. Some actions involved supergluing locks or damaging windows with etching fluid, and some involved the most controversial activities such as arson or the mass release of minks from fur farms. As suggested above, my time as press contact occurred at the very beginning of the process, by which virtually all animal advocates became routinely and systematically dismissed as some form of terrorists. In my day, those who wanted to see significant change in human-non-human relations were much more likely to be dismissed as cranks, perhaps significantly the name of the most famous vegetarian restaurant of the era to be pitied more than anything else. The change in the way modern-day animal activists are perceived is captured in the very title, as well as the content of a recent collection of essays on contemporary animal activism, terrorists, or freedom fighters, Steve Best and Anthony Nocella too. As a consequence of growing militancy, however, I quickly became associated, through media work, with acts of illegality in support of the perceived interests of non-human others. There were some stirrings of changes with regard to media coverage during this period. My time engaged in press liaison in the early 1980s coincided with a distinct shift in the way the invigorated animal movement was discussed, portrayed, and characterized by the international mass media. In essence, media coverage of campaigning had, to a significant degree, moved from being largely dismissive, neutral, or sometimes positive to being distinctly negative in tone. Of course, peaceful campaigning had continued throughout, with organizations such as Animal Aid going to lengths to disassociate themselves from the most militant of the animal liberationists. As ever, though, exclusively peaceful activity is generally ignored by the mass media rather than dismissed or championed. Campaign organizations may spend months on a project or protest march and a great deal of money, only to find a virtual news blackout on their concerns, unless something newsworthy occurs. This helps to explain, if not excuse, why modern mobilizations such as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and Fathers for Justice have engaged in more and more outrageous publicity stunts involving nude celebrities and activists dressed as superheroes. In fact, one of the principal reasons I agreed to act as spokesperson for one of the more militant groups was the very fact that their activities were not ignored by mass media industries, thereby facilitating some chance of elaborating on the motivation for the actions undertaken. In a Massachusetts thesis, A Sociology of Compromise, Yates, I cited research Samuel Barnes et al., which, despite being dated, provides some data on the relationship between militant and non-militant activities and mass media coverage. A 5-nation study of unconventional political action, revealing that the circulation of petitions and legal demonstrations represented protest activities with the highest public approval scores 85% and 67% respectively. This compares to product boycotts at 37%. Categories such as rent strikes, occupying buildings, blocking traffic, unofficial strikes, painting slogans, personal violence, and damaging property achieved approval ratings below 20%. These data suggest that the activities most favored by the public are least likely to be considered newsworthy by a mass media whose exacting criteria is focused on issues such as campaign or protest size, drama, and novelty. Moreover, and in line with some social movement theorizing, which conceptualizes the relationship between the mass media and social movements as a media dance. And note 4, Thomas Rochon reports that it is common to find media coverage of protest, focusing almost exclusively on issues of militancy and law breaking, but with little or no articulation of the substantive or philosophical issues involved. I had noticed how media industries had seemed to up the ante in terms of what they were prepared to cover, be it on TV, radio, or in the national and regional press. For example, some journalists made it absolutely clear to me that I need not bother contact them about any mere demonstration or some orthodox protest activity until at least one person had been arrested or, better still, injured. And note 5. This explains why one of my busiest times with the press was during the staging of the notorious Waterloo Cup hare coursing event in Altcar, near Liverpool in 1984. 34-year-old Eddie Colston, on his first outing as a hunt saboteur, was attacked with a metal shooting stick by hare coursing supporter Paul Willingale and suffered a fractured skull requiring brain surgery. He was left afflicted with subsequent epileptic fits, while Willingale was sentenced to 6 months in prison. On the same day, a fight among hare coursers left one of their number dead. Initial press reports speculated that a SAB had been murdered. Details in Keith Mann, and see his chapter entitled The Sheffield Trial for a fuller account of my trial. In concurrence with the findings of several scholars who have studied the relationship between social movements and the mass media, campaigners had to, or were made to feel, that they must engage in increased militancy and preferably illegal activity to ensure publicity. And note 6. Before the advent of the internet, social movements were rather reliant on mass media coverage in terms of much of their public outreach opportunities. Contemporary social movements, and indeed individual campaigners, have sophisticated websites featuring documents and video clips. However, although this provides them with an alternative to the formal media, it remains the case that the mass in mass media attempts contact with national and international media outlets. Even moderate forms of illegality seemed no longer to satisfy mass media interests by the mid-1980s. For example, where once photographs and descriptions of beagle-carrying activists exiting laboratories virtually guaranteed front-page news and generally favorable copy. New criteria meant that substantial acts of damage and/or acts of arson were required to achieve widespread and sizable coverage. It was during this escalation of militancy that I unsurprisingly found myself on the wrong side of the criminal law and involved in what many regard as the largest animal rights show trial hitherto prosecuted in Britain. In quick succession, after being in receipt of a 4-year prison sentence, I encountered the realities of time on remand. And as a convicted prisoner in several overcrowded Victorian local jails in Hull, Liverpool, and Leeds, before a final move to a semi-open prison to serve out the majority of my term at Her Majesty's pleasure. While education was something of a hit-and-miss affair in the former settings, it was a full-time but relatively low-paid option in the semi-open prison. And so, surrounded by fellow prisoners, probation officers, petty bureaucrats, overworked education staff members, and prison guards of differing tempers, I had my first taste of the sociology of crime. I now rather inform students, without going into any of the gory details, of course, that sociology really does seek to explain what one perfectly well knows about already. Of course, as soon as I was taught a little social scientific methodology, I understood that I wasn't paying some debt to society after all, but instead taking part in an elaborate qualitative research project utilizing long-term participant observation techniques. Not that I was particularly successful in terms of integrating into general prison life. Never liable to go native, I was clearly different compared with the average con, which is a pretty dangerous position to be in inside jail. As a marker of this outsider status, and although they were not really supposed to, some of the prison guards treated me as a political prisoner on the grounds that I did not profit by what I'd done. On the other hand, since I might get hundreds of birthday and Christmas cards as a result of being on the lists put out by support animal rights prisoners, I was told by prison officials that this continuing involvement with the issue by which I had got into trouble meant I was probably damaging my parole odds. The other cons, many of whom called me Mr. Vegan, marking another major difference between the general prison population and myself, were, by and large, extremely mystified by my lack of payment for my activities. They were more than pleased, however, that I always had a drawer full of vegan biscuits on hand for them when they were searching the prison wing to satisfy the munchies after a cannabis party. Surely, though, they asked as a general matter, a payment must have been involved for attending a demonstration? And note 7, in a similar way, when I first attended Hunt Sab's The Sabotage of Hunting in 1979, Hunt supporters were convinced that the saboteurs were paid and organized by sinister forces. We played along with this, telling them that we received an envelope each Thursday complete with cash and a map of where the hunts will be on the following Saturday. We told them that we had no idea who sent the money, but had noticed that all the R's were typed the wrong way round. More than one prison inmate casually wondered by these naive animal people, myself included, didn't simply kidnap a few vivisectors, tie them to trees, and break their hands with baseball bats. This is a sure way, I was told, to stop them re-entering the laboratory. Obvious, really. This reaction from fellow prisoners echoed the earlier experience of Ronnie Lee, the co-founder of the Animal Liberation Front, who was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in 1975 for arson attacks on establishments associated with the vivisection industry. As animal protectionist Mark Gold explains, Lee was treated with a degree of sympathy by prison guards and prisoners alike, though the general response was one of disbelief that anybody could have risked their freedom for the cause of animals when they could have stolen $100 grand and still faced the same sentence. Ronnie Lee was later to receive a 10-year sentence in the same trial I received my 4-year term. The severity of his sentence, which coincided with the lenient terms handed down to some of the so-called vicarage rape defendants, led to questions being asked in the House of Commons in London. Once I had been exposed to critical criminological texts, for example Stephen Bach's, I learned more and more about the ideological nature of such sentence disparities and system biases. For all the lack of social integration in my own prison situation, I realized later that my experience was rather sociologically rich and was a deal more valid in a limited sense than other accounts I heard when I left prison to begin a university undergraduate course that included sociology, social policy, and criminology. For example, I remember vividly my first taste of university criminology, in which the professor delighted in shocking his young first-year audience with the dramatic declaration that some of my best friends are lifers. I had also met a number of prisoners doing life in my time behind bars, and most, probably all, would have scoffed at the professor's confident assertion that he had the ear of all involved in every level of the criminal justice system, from government ministers, administrators, and prison governors to general staff, the eponymous screws lifers, and the general prison population. I had seen the lifer inmates' tears and heard the psychologically relieving jokes. After an emotional prison visit, the missus brought my 5-year-old for a visit this time. Problem is, I've been inside for 8 years. I had witnessed the anxieties before another round of psychological profiling, and the often intense forces that appeared to pull and push these men from apparent confidence to utter despair and back again. What they would rarely do, they admitted this to me as a trusted fellow con, was say much at all to any of their arty-farty middle-class inquisitors that would not, in their perception, go down extremely favorably with the British government's Home Office Department. In other words, they would regularly try to work out exactly what official interviewers wanted of them, whoever and whatever interviewers identified themselves as, especially those who attended on special visits as an academic might, and then attempt to provide it. Of course, not every single statement of prisoners in such circumstances would be designed to indirectly impress politicians and probation staff, as Laurie Taylor discovered when imprisoned respondents subsequently claimed that, in previous interviews, they had deliberately exaggerated and amplified accounts of their crimes and capers to test out his gullibility. For all the confidence in my professor's assertion, then, the truth is that lifers, of all people within a prison system, would be trying to feed him exactly the answers they believed he required. I believe that my own experience of confinement and subsequent tuition in the sociology of crime better equipped me in terms of understanding the nature and validity of sociological findings, and also helped me adopt a reflexive attitude toward my past activities. If my criminological participant observation had led me to many revelations about parts of the British prison system, then my general education course in sociology taught me a lot about society, quite apart from the rather black and white campaigner's image of social life and power relations I had relied on since at least the late 1970s. During my sociological studies, I suddenly realized that the social sciences had a good deal to offer, and not least to social movement participants. This raises the issue of the bridge figures I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. Sociology can help to explain the public and mass media reaction to social movements' campaigning messages, the nature of societal power relations, the origins and ideological maintenance of general attitudes about issues that concern them. And social scientific knowledge assists in the understanding of why certain of their arguments and claims meet with evasion and denial. During my MA and doctoral period at Bangor University, I was able to explore this notion of bridge people with fellow PhD candidate now, Dr. Alexandra Plows. We both entertained the idea that we may act as bridges between the animal protection movement, the radical environmental movement such as Earth First, and academia. Alex's interests include investigations of the radical green movement in general terms, but especially social movement activists' identity politics and networking practices. Together, we worked on a postgraduate dissertation project, Alexandra Plows and Roger Yates, on so-called New Age travelers, especially those whose activities were frequently subject to media coverage, often in the form of a moral panic in the 1990s in Britain. Since Alex had been, like myself, a campaigner before an academic, we realized that not only did this prior experience give us privileged access in terms of research opportunities, it also placed us in the role of translator. For example, as said, it had rapidly occurred to me that advocates of non-human interests often held on to a rather crude and psychology-driven picture of the forces that drive and resist social change. On the other hand, scholarship and the theoretical understanding of collective action had been poor and certainly unsophisticated until at least the 1980s and 1990s. We began to see our roles then as translating our movement to the academy and explaining relevant social forces and processes to the movement. Success in this endeavor has, for me, been patchy at best. I blame the social sciences. For no longer able to see the world exclusively through a black and white campaigner's lens, it is often hard not to feel alienated from many of those one once had a great affinity with. A recent study of the animal advocacy movement by Bob Torres, who approaches the issues of human-non-human relations and social movement advocacy from a political scientist's and a social anarchist's position, suggests that there is a great emphasis in the animal movement to do something and virtually anything for the animals. To some extent, this attitude is a result of the sheer size of the problem faced by animal advocates, for example, many thousands of our fellow animals being killed every second just for flesh consumption. In this sense, many advocates feel they simply do not the time, let alone the inclination, to get embroiled in abstract philosophical disputes about human-non-human relations. This has left a considerable philosophical muddle at the center of the animal protection movement with its competing philosophies based on rights theory, ecofeminism, anarchism, utilitarianism, and traditional animal welfarism. There is so much resistance to philosophizing, yet it is the philosophy of a social movement that directs and informs its campaigning claims as it acts as a claims-making enterprise in civil society. It leaves a great deal of work to do for a bridge person like myself. Bibliography: Adams, C.J. 2000's The Sexual Politics of Meat, A Feminist Vegetarian Critical Theory, 10th Anniversary ed., New York Continuum, 2004. The Pornography of Meat, New York Continuum, Barnes S., Cass M. et al., 1979, Political Action, Mass Participation in 5 Western Democracies, Beverly Hills, Sage. Barnett H., 1999. The Land Ethic and Environmental Criminology, Criminal Justice Policy Review, 10-161-192, Becker H. 1963 Outsiders. Studies in the Sociology of Deviance, New York, Free Press. Bairn P. 1994. The Law is an Ass, reading E.P. Evans, The Medieval Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, Society and Animals, 2-1, 27-46, 1995. The Use and Abuse of Animals in Criminology, A Brief History and Current Review, Social Justice, 22-1, 5-31. 1997. Rethinking Bestiality, Towards a Concept of Interspecies Sexual Assault, Theoretical Criminology, 1-3, 317-40. 1999. For a non-speciesist criminology, Animal Abuse as an Object of Study, Criminology, 37-1, 117-47. 2007. Animal Rights, Animal Abuse and Green Criminology, in P. Byrne and N. South, eds. Issues in Green Criminology, Confronting Harms Against Environments, Humanity and Other Animals, Colompton, Willen, Best S. and Noshella 2, A.J. eds. 2004 Terrorists or Freedom Fighters, Reflections on the Liberation of Animals, New York, Lantern, Box S, 1989. Power, Crime, and Mystification, London, Routledge, 1989. Kazoji, 1999. Beauty and the Beast, Animal Abuse from a Non-Speciesist Criminological Perspective, Crime, Law, and Social Change, 31-2, 105-25. Cohen S., 2001 States of Denial, Knowing About Atrocities and Suffering, Cambridge, Polity, Francione, G.L., 1995 Animals, Property and the Law, Philadelphia, Temple University Press. 1996 Rain Without Thunder, The Ideology of the Animal Rights Movement, Philadelphia, Temple University Press. 2000's Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog, Philadelphia, Temple University Press. 2008. Animals as Persons, Essays on the Abolition of Animal Exploitation, New York, Columbia University Press. Freeman J. and Johnson V. eds. 1999 Waves of Protest, Social Movements Since the 60s, Oxford, Rowman, and Littlefield. Gitlin T., 1987, The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, London, Bantam. Gold, M., 1998, Animal Century, A Celebration of Changing Attitudes to Animals, Charlbury, Carpenter. Hall L., 2006, Capers in the Graveyard, Animal Rights in the Age of Terror, Darien, Kahn, Nectar Bat Press. Halsey M., 2004, Against Green Criminology, British Journal of Criminology, 44-6, 833-853. Kelly M., 2007, Environmental Debates and the Public in Ireland, Dublin, Institute of Public Administration, Lynch M.J., 1990. The Greening of Criminology, A Perspective on the 1990s, The Critical Criminologist, 2-3. 2003. The Meaning of Green, Towards a Green Criminology, Theoretical Criminology, 7-217-238. Lynch M.J. and Stratesky P.B., 2001, Toxic Crimes, Examining Corporate Victimization of the General Public Employing Medical and Epidemiological Evidence, Critical Criminology, 10-3, 153-172. Lynch M.J., McGurran D., and Fenwick M., 2004, Disappearing Act, The Representation of Corporate Crime Research in Criminology Journals and Textbooks, Journal of Criminal Justice, 32-5, 389-398. Mann K., From Dusk Till Dawn, An Insider's View of the Growth of the Animal Liberation Movement, London Puppy Pincher Press, Mies, M., and Shiva, N. Ecofeminism, London, Z. O'Hear M., 2004, Sentencing the Green Collar Offender, Punishment, Culpability, and Environmental Crime, The Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, 95-1, 133-276. Plows A. and Yates R., 1997, Break the Rules, Breaking the Stereotype of the New Age Traveler, unpublished M., a research project. Department of Sociology, University of Wales, Bangor. Regan T., 1983, The Case for Animal Rights, Berkeley, University of California Press. 2001, Defending Animal Rights, Urbana and Chicago, University of Illinois Press. 2004, Empty Cages, Facing the Challenge of Animal Rights, Oxford, Rowman and Littlefield. Regan T. and Roe M. 2003, What the Nobel Committee Also Failed to Notice, International Herald Tribune, Dec. Roshan T., 1990. The West European Peace Movement and the Theory of New Social Movements, in R.J. Dalton, and Mem Kiekler eds. Challenging the Political Order, New Social and Political Movements in Western Democracies, Cambridge, Polity. Salt H., 1980-1922, Animals' Rights, Considered in Relation to Social Progress, Fontwell, Sussex, The Centaur Press. Seidman S., 1998, Contested Knowledge, Social Theory in the Postmodern Era, 2nd ed., Oxford, Blackwell, Sutherland, A. 1949, White Collar Crime, New York, Dryden, Taylor Day. 2000, The Rise of the Environmental Justice Paradigm, American Behavioral Scientist, 43-4, 508-580. Taylor L., 1984, In the Underworld, London, Unwin. Torres B., 2007, Making a Killing, The Political Economy of Animal Rights, Edinburgh, AK Press. Tovey H., 2007, Environmentalism in Ireland, Movement and Activists, Dublin, Institute of Public Administration, Wilson N.K. 1999, Eco-Critical Criminology, An Introduction, Criminal Justice Policy Review, 10-2, 155-160, Yates R., 1998. A Sociology of Compromise, Social Movement Theory, and the British Animal Protection Movement, unpublished MA dissertation, School of Social Sciences, University of Wales, Bangor, 2005, The Social Construction of Human Beings and Other Animals in Human Relations. Welfarism and Rights, A Contemporary Sociological Analysis, unpublished PhD thesis, Department of Sociology, University of Wales, Yates R., Powell C. and Bairn P., 2001. Horse Maiming in the English Countryside, Moral Panic, Human Deviance, and the Social Construction of Victimhood, Society and Animals, 9-1, 1-24.